he was the Dean of Humanities at Rhodes University in Grahamstown, Makanda in South Africa from 2005 to 2014. And he's also the founding editor of the Codestria Journal, African Sociological Review, and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Contemporary African Studies. He's also the president of the South African Sociological, he was also the president of the South African Sociological Association and the founding president of the South African Humanities Deans Association, SAHUDA, a Fulbright research scholar at Birmingham University, New York in the US, and a visiting professor at the University of Uppsala. He's has also been a guest researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute in Sweden and the University of Basel in Switzerland, as well as the University of Addis in Ethiopia. He was the external examiner at various universities, including the University of Cape Town, University of Botswana, Addis, University of Natal, Wits, Western Cape, Fort Hare, and he was appointed on the Ministerial Task Force on Experts on Foreign Land Ownership in South Africa, and a trustee for the Trust for the Community Outreach and Education. He has published 6 so-authored and edited books and numerous articles, as well as book chapters, principally in the field of land and agrarian studies. He is currently the emeritus professor at Rhodes University, a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa, an associate director of the African Humanities Program, the AHP program, an executive member of the African Humanities Association, a revolving mentor for the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences in South Africa, and the chairperson of the NHISS panel of judges for nonfiction books, and is also on the board of directors of Aphesis Copland and an editor of African Humanities series. So we are quite privileged to host you, Prof, to lead this conversation on land issues. So without further ado, let me allow Prof to get us started.
Let me just take my watch off so that I can see how I'm going. Thank you very much, Simba, for that introduction, and thanks also to Eddie for suggesting the seminar. It's an important topic, and it kind of has a very checkered history in our political landscape, because sometimes it's on top of the agenda, and at other times it just drifts into obscurity, into the background. From my perspective, it is an absolutely vital issue that we need to deal with in all seriousness. So I've entitled this Expropriation of Land in South Africa, Rhetoric and Reality. And a few weeks ago, I was invited by Defend Our Democracy to a debate on the Expropriation of Land Act, the new act. And it was a very interesting engagement because there were opposing views on the act. And I thought that subsequent to that, I have to say I was very pleased that one of my favorite radio programs early in the morning with Thulasizwe Similani, between 6 and 9, he also interviewed me about that seminar with Defend Our Democracy. And it's all around how are we going to deal with the land question in South Africa. And the land question in South Africa is a very, very simple question. It is a question premised on extreme inequality in the distribution of and access to land in the country, premised on a racialized distribution. But we'll talk about that as we go along. So the first thing that I think we need to do is to draw a distinction between expropriation as a concept and this particular act, the particular Land Expropriation Act. And from my point of view, while expropriation may be a necessary part of a program of fundamental land redistribution, I think this particular Expropriation Act, number 13 of 2024, which together with the current political environment which we inhabit at the moment, these to my mind, are not the answers to our land reform problems. And I'll go into reasons as to why I say this. So, but before we begin, I think some historical precedent is important, and we're going back more than 2,000 years. So this is a quotation from Plutarch in his The Lives of the Gracchi. This is Tiberius and Caius. And he says, I'm not going to read the whole quote, just the important part for our purposes. Never did any law appear more moderate and gentle, especially being enacted against so great an oppression and avarice. So Tiberius died in 133 BC, and he is most famous for his attempt at land reform, an effort to redistribute land from wealthy landowners and the state to the poor in Rome in the 2nd century before Christ. I mean, it's a very long time ago. It's just to give you a sense that the kind of land inequality we're dealing with now is not a new thing. It's millennia, literally millennia old. And so what Plutarch has said about what the Gracchi attempted can be said about our new Expropriation Act as well. I'll repeat the quote. Never did any law appear more moderate and gentle, especially being enacted against so great an oppression and avarice. Now, I've termed this talk rhetoric and reality, and I think it's important to keep in mind that there has been a huge amount of emotion around the issue of land, and there always is. And that emotion often spills over into unhelpful, emotive statements and sentiments, which do not help us at all in resolving what is, to my mind, one of the more serious problems that we are facing in this country, and that's the land issue. So what is the problem really, if we were to think about it? I want to start here also with a quotation from probably the most famous South African, but I'm not sure whether he will go by the name of South African since he lives in Australia now, James Coetzee, one of our Nobel Prize winners. But this is what he says about land. He says, he's talking about white South Africans. Our attitude was that our presence was legal but illegitimate. And I'll come back to that differentiation because I think it's quite an important differentiation. Legal but illegitimate. We had an abstract right, in other words, a legal right to be here. But the basis of that right was fraudulent. Our presence was grounded in a crime, namely colonial conquest perpetuated by apartheid. And so we need to have a kind of understanding of the way in which racialized dispossession happened in South Africa. What James Coetzee is talking about is a perspective from white South Africans who managed over a period of, shall we say, 200 to 300 years, managed to dispossess the majority of land in South Africa. And this has been the ongoing colonial legacy that we are still trying to deal with today. 1994 has not really resulted in a full decolonization of South Africa at all. And I think that you need to draw a distinction also between decolonization and decoloniality. The two are quite different. And if you want to, I can go into that, but I don't want to do that now. But if you think about it, South Africa experienced more land dispossession than any other sub-Saharan African country. And if you were to compare South Africa with any of the other African countries, let's take Tanzania, for example. In Tanzania, white settlers expropriated only 1% of the land surface of that country, only 1%. The rest of Tanzania remained in Tanzanian hands, managed by Tanzanians and worked by Tanzanians and controlled by Tanzanians. If you take a country like Zambia, where white settlement took only about 3% of the land surface of the country. But then you come to what Samir Amin famously called the Africa of the labor reserves, and that's Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. In Namibia, white settlers took 44% of the land. In Zimbabwe, they took between 50 and 60% of the land. In South Africa, they took more than 90% of the land surface. In 1913, which was a very famous land act, which was a land law that basically legitimated the land wars, and it apportioned only 7.3% of the land surface of the entire country for the exclusive inhabitation of Africans. So the dispossession of indigenous South Africans resulted in widespread landlessness amongst the majority of the population. And that, of course, means that you have an entirely different situation in South Africa if you were to compare it to any other African country. So I will come back to discuss in a little bit of detail the land question and the agrarian question, because those two questions go hand in hand, so to speak. But let me just say that there is widespread agreement in South Africa that racialized land inequality is a problem. Everybody agrees that you can't really have a situation where, and the reality that we're dealing with at the moment is that 40,000 only 40,000 white farmers own half of the land surface of this country. And that is a staggering statistic that we need to deal with. So while there is agreement that racialized land inequality is a problem, if you have, I haven't worked out the maths of it, but whatever little percentage 40,000 of 64 million is, owning half of the country, you have a deep problem, not only from the point of view of the citizenship of the majority of the people who have been dispossessed like that, but you have a problem from the point of view of the sustainability of democracy itself. Because in order for democracy to survive, there needs to be some kind of sense that people have that they have a stake in the system. And if they are uprooted in that way, what that level of inequality does... Sorry? There was... Can I go on?
Yeah, muitigwa manje muchaitigwa ikoko bosi kune masoja shamwe.
Sorry, Prof. Sorry about that.
Can I proceed?
Yes. Sorry about that, Prof. Let me check on the participants and mute as we go.
Okay, no worries. So you're dealing with this fundamental problem of racialized land inequality. It is a deep problem. And while there's agreement that it is a problem, there are many differences about what we should be doing about it. And those differences depend on, I would say, 6 different variables. First of all, what should be the extent of land reform? In other words, to put it bluntly, how much land should be transferred into black ownership? That's to put it absolutely blunt. How much of it? Now, if you look at the targets that the democratic government came up with in 1994, the target was that we will transfer 30% of agricultural land into black hands in the first 5 years of democracy. So they were aiming for 1999, 30% of land would be redistributed into black hands. That was the target. That was the election platform of the ANC at the time. We are now 30 years into democracy, and according to a very recent statement by Cyril Ramaphosa, 25% of 25% of white agricultural land has been transferred into black hands. But that 25% still is a drop in the ocean when you look at the country as a whole. And I'll come back to that whole thing about 40,000 white farmers. So the extent of land reform is very definitely an issue. How much land should be transferred from white hands into black hands? The second issue is the pace of land reform. How quickly should it happen? If over 30 years you transfer, because you're starting in 1994, we're looking specifically now at agricultural land, but we will see also that we need to disaggregate that problem. If you take 30 years to transfer 25%, you can just imagine how long it will take to transfer the bulk of the land into the hands of the bulk of the population. And then the third issue, the third problem is the methods of land reform. Do we use a market-based system or should it be state-driven? Now, to my mind, land reform is intrinsically a state-driven program. It ought to be a state-driven program. But you have a huge problem when your state is incapable for a variety of different reasons. It could be because of corruption, it could be because of incapacity, it could be because of a lack of expertise, it could be because of a whole variety of different reasons that the state is incapable. So while land reform necessarily has to be driven by the state, because you are trying to shift ownership of land from one group of people to another, that's effectively what land reform is about. So in South Africa, we adopted a system of land reform that was market-based rather than state-driven. There have been attempts to introduce levels of land reform via programs, which I'll talk about just now, and we will talk about them. So let me just say that's the third issue. The fourth is whether expropriation of land should be permitted, and should that expropriation be with or without compensation. I want us to just come back here, to J.M. Coetzee's quote that the basis of the right that whites had to be in South Africa was fraudulent, because it was premised on, it was grounded in crime. So when a right is grounded in crime, the question that you have to ask yourself is whether a constitutional provision that simply accepts the existing division of property, whether it is a just way of proceeding in a democracy. So that whole question about whether expropriation should be with or without compensation has caused a huge sensation, so to speak, in the press and so on. It's a furore across the board in the popular press. But in fact, if you were to look more closely at the Act, and I'll ask Simba to just raise the particular clause which is important, and then if compensation is decided upon, how will that compensation be determined? And the last thing is the post-transfer assistance. So what should happen after, let's say, people get land as a result of land reform? Land is transferred into their ownership or into their control. What kind of support does the state provide for people after the transfer? So those are the kind of broadly the issues around land reform, so to speak. We need to disaggregate the problem into three main areas. The first is agricultural land under freehold. So this is what's traditionally known as the white platteland, or white commercial agricultural land, which is a vast part of South African land. And this is where the land and agrarian questions intersect, really, because what is the agrarian question? It's a much broader question than the land question. The land question is dealing with racialized land inequality and how we address that inequality towards a more equitable distribution of land. The agrarian question is a broader question. It deals with the penetration of capitalism into the rural areas and the transformation of rural social relations into from independent producing peasants into proletarians, from people who can make a living for themselves out of farming to people who are entirely dependent on wage labor for their survival. So that's what, and then there's a political offshoot of the agrarian question, because it relates to how you can connect up people politically who are rural based and still making a living partially out of farming, and how they can connect up with the interests of the urban proletarian workers, symbolized, of course, by the hammer and the sickle. So those two questions are very important. But at the moment, we have 40,000 white farmers. And those 40,000 white farmers own 75% of the agricultural land in the country. And the 75% of agricultural land constitutes half of the land surface of the country as a whole. The other 25% is made up of urban land and the reserves. Now, we have not dismantled the reserves. So this is how we're disaggregating the problem. These three main areas: white commercial agriculture, the reserves or the Bantustans or the homelands, whatever you want to call them, and then urban land. If you look at the reserves, if you look at the Bantustans, we have not dismantled them. We've not dismantled them because they remain differentiated from South Africa, from the rest of South Africa, by a distinctive form of land tenure and a distinctive form of local government. And as long as you have this differentiation of the country, as long as you have a perpetuation of the reserves, you are forever going to get problems of tenure security in those areas. You're going to have problems of people not being secure in their access to and control over their land. They're not going to be secure. They're not going to have tenure security. Now, why did we not dismantle the reserves? There are a whole range of issues around this, but it reflects a political orientation which thought at the time that it might be better to use traditional authorities in these areas as part of an alliance to align with traditional authorities rather than to align with popular opposition. For those people who lived during those years, the years leading up to 1994, all of them would know that traditional authorities were regarded as impimpi. They were regarded as collaborators. They were regarded as collaborators. They were regarded as people who were basically the junior partners of the apartheid regime. That is what chiefs were seen as. There were pitched battles between the youth and civic organizations and the chiefs. Many of them lost their lives in those battles. But the chiefs were rehabilitated in a democratic South Africa by a government that sought to ingratiate themselves with the chiefs in the hope that through the chiefs they would get the support of the majority of the people in these reserve areas. The problem, of course, is this, that it's a problem of legitimacy. There are some chiefs, despite everything that's happened, after the Bantu Authorities Act in the early 1950s, it was impossible to be a chief with some respect. You might be a junior headman with some respect, but virtually all chiefs became fully enmeshed in the apartheid regime. They became the junior partners of the apartheid state, effectively. And it is those people then that were rehabilitated in a so-called democratic environment, because they are obviously not democrats, because they do not rule by agreement, they rule by dissent. They rule by an ascribed status that's given to them by their status as royalty. And then, of course, once they become rehabilitated by a democratic environment, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to develop a level of tenure security for people who are living there, because increasingly the chiefs see themselves as the owners and in many cases try to get the land in their name specifically and exclude the majority, or as happened within Gonyama Trust in KZN, to use the land as a source of income by illegally charging people rent in those lands. So they basically become the landowner of that. They become a kind of feudal lord over the land, and the people are their tenants paying rent to them. The third area, of course, is urban land, and the main problem when we're addressing urban land is the problem of housing. It's the main problem. The problem of housing is the land question of the urban area, and you will see across all South African urban areas there are growing squatter populations, and there are huge issues there. I mean, that can be a seminar on its own, just to talk about the list system and how deeply problematic it is. So the problem of housing is a fundamental problem that we've not begun to solve. In Cape Town, where I live, it is a particular problem: growing homelessness, growing land invasions, a problem. We have an anti-land invasion unit in the city to try to deal with people who are occupying a land illegitimately. So you can't just see the land question as a rural question. The land question is also fundamentally an urban question. There are other types of land as well. Church land is important, state land is also important. But I think in terms of land reform, these are the three main areas in contention around land reform. So what were the policy efforts to deal with land inequality since 1994? So the democratic government came up with a land policy which had three pillars. There were effectively three pillars in the land reform policy. It was land redistribution, land restitution, and land tenure reform. So land redistribution was to try to redistribute land into black hands towards a more equitable distribution of land across the country. Restitution of land was supposed to be for people who had actively lost their land after 1913, which is an important cutoff. If you acquired land outside of those reserves, that's 7.3%. That 7.3% of the land surface was extended in 1936 to 13%, and that's where you get 13% becomes the popular percentage, but the initial percentage was 7.3%. But if you owned land, if you were black and you owned land outside of the reserves, and that land was taken away as a result of the application of apartheid laws, then you could be restituted with land. And then tenure reform it applied to two main areas. It applied to the reserve areas, where we've just spoken about the lack of tenure security, but it also applied to the commercial agricultural land, where we had farm laborers who, as a result of a long history of paternalism, you would live on the farm, and it is still the reality on most, if not many farms across the country. You live on the farm and you work on the farm. And so if you lose your job as a farm laborer, you simultaneously also lose your place of residence, you lose your house. And so there was an attempt by the democratic government to at least instill a greater degree of tenure security for farm laborers living on farms and also for reserve residents living under the rulership of chiefs. A critical point in any discussion on land in South Africa has to be Section 25 of the South African Constitution, because these three main policy points, restitution, redistribution, and tenure reform, they come directly from the South African Constitution. And we need to have an understanding of what the Constitution was about and how it attempted to provide a compromise, because effectively the South African Constitution is a compromise between black aspirations and white property. It's black aspirations on the one hand and white property on the other. The Constitution tries to strike a middle ground between those two. What it does, however, is it safeguards the existing landowners in their property. And that's what it does. If you look at Section 25 of the Constitution, it makes that quite explicit. And by doing that, it effectively, from my point of view anyway, provides a legal sanction for colonial land dispossession. And that has the effect, the consequence of that is that any attempt at redistribution will become complicated and a deeply litigious process. We'll come back to that again when we see how that actually works out in practice. I do here just want to give one quotation from a famous judge, Judge John Didcot, and this comes from a statement that he made in 1988 while the Bill of Rights was being constructed. And this was his warning, and I think it was a prescient warning. He said, "What a Bill of Rights cannot afford to do here is to protect private property with such zeal that it entrenches privilege. A major problem with any future South African government is bound to face will be the problem of poverty, of its alleviation, and of the need for the country's wealth to be shared more equitably. Should a Bill of Rights obstruct the government of the day when that direction is taken, should it make the urgent task of social and economic reform impossible or difficult to undertake, we shall have on our hands a crisis of the first order, endangering the Bill of Rights as a whole and the survival of constitutional government itself." And I think that we are in this crisis now. We are in this crisis, and the way in which he puts it across is very clear, to protect private property with such zeal that it entrenches privilege. And that is effectively what our Constitution does. I want to give you one example, and this is the example of the Dinkwani case in Mpumalanga. So this was the first expropriation order in a democratic South Africa. So just to give you a bit of background about the Dinkwani case. In 1906, the Dinkwani community, which is just in Lydenburg, in Mpumalanga, they bought this farm. The community clubbed together and they bought the farm. Boomplaats is the name of the farm. They bought it in 1906. In 1961, they were forcibly removed from their farm. Their farm was expropriated from them without compensation. They were kicked off their land. They scattered all over the country, of course, and then when the Restitution Act came into effect, they applied for restitution. So the government, the then apartheid government, took control of the farm, leased it out to white farmers for 20 years, and then in 1981 sold the farm at below market value to a white farmer by the name of Willem Pretorius. Now the people were claiming their land back. They wanted their land back. Just to cut a long story short, Willem Pretorius, in terms of the Constitution, there has to be an agreement between the buyer and the seller. the seller was not interested in the price that was being offered by the state, by the new democratic state. The state then issued its first expropriation order under the previous Expropriation Act, the Expropriation Act of 1975. Pretorius opposed the expropriation order, and just to cut a long story short, the then minister had to withdraw the first expropriation order in a democratic government. Just to give you that sense, because the Expropriation Act of 1975 was entirely out of sync with the Constitution, with Section 25 of the Constitution. But even be that as it may, it's still deeply, deeply, deeply problematic. But that's just to give you a sense of how problematic it is, because a farmer who gets this farm paying very little for it then demands from the new democratic state a price which is ridiculous in terms of its just completely out of sync with its market value, and prevents an expropriation order on that kind of basis. To date, since 1994, no land in South Africa has been expropriated without compensation, despite what Donald Trump has been saying. The provisions of the new Expropriation Act mirror those of the Constitution. They've been brought in line with the Constitution, even in its wording. What they've done is two things. The new Act has added two things. It's added the provision for expropriation in the public interest. The previous Expropriation Act, the 1975 one, the apartheid government one, that one spoke about expropriation for public purposes. The new Act speaks about expropriation for public purposes and in the public interest, where public interest by and large is land reform. So the new Expropriation Act is an effort to open up possibilities for land reform. But let's just see what the prospects are of its success. Firstly, we must remember that there was an attempt in December of 2021 to amend the Constitution to include expropriation without compensation. I don't know if you remember that, but there was an attempt. The attempt failed to pass muster in the National Assembly. Parliament could not muster up the 75% that was needed for this amendment of the Constitution to allow expropriation without compensation. So now this new Act makes a provision for compensation which is nil, for nil compensation. I wonder if you can't just put up the relevant chapter 5, section 3 in that act. I wonder if you just couldn't put it up for me, please, so that I can see it. Okay, here it is. I don't know if you've had a chance to read this, but what it shows is it is very, very, very difficult to expropriate land for nil compensation. It is an extremely circumspect piece of legislation. So let's just look at it. Where land is not being used and the owner's main purpose is not to develop the land or to generate an income, but instead to benefit from appreciation of its market value. In other words, it is where land is being used purely for speculative purposes. That land can be expropriated with nil compensation. And even there would be a lot of discussion around it. And quite frankly, I think that is how it ought to be. If somebody is sitting on thousands of hectares of land and he or she is not doing anything on it, and there are many, many people who are desirous of land, do we allow that person to continue to just accumulate the capital on the basis that the land belongs to him because of an historical accident, the historical accident of colonialism, of course. We don't need to deal with this. This is an organ of state. If one organ of state holds land and another organ of state requires it, the state can expropriate the land from that organ of state in order to make it available for land reform. If the land, number C, if the land has been abandoned by the owner, or has failed to exercise control of it, then you can expropriate that land without. In other words, if you have a block of flats in Hillbrow that has been abandoned, then of course you can expropriate that land without compensation. And then the last one, where the market value of the land is equivalent to or less than the present value of direct state investment or subsidy in the acquisition and beneficial capital improvement of the land. So it's not a case. If you look at the Institute of Race Relations, or you look at the DA or the Freedom Front or AfriForum or Solidarity, they're making a huge issue about the fact that we now have permission to expropriate land without compensation. But as you can see, the reality is very far removed from that rhetoric. The reality is that it is an incredibly circumscribed piece of legislation. It's not going to lead to an answer to our land reform problems at all. And just to say also these kinds of things, outstanding municipal property rates, taxes, levies, charges. If somebody's property is indebted because they've not paid rates for decades, then why can't you expropriate that land without compensation? I don't know if you're following me there. Why is it going to be deeply litigious? It's going to be deeply litigious because our Constitution still says nothing about expropriation of land without compensation. It says explicitly that if land is to be expropriated, it will have to be compensated, and that compensation must be just and equitable. That's what the Constitution says. Now, in situations like this, so the big legal question will be whether those provisions are just and equitable or not. But you can see that if the Constitution says there ought to be compensation, and a law says you can expropriate without compensation, there is going to be a lot of legal wrangling over this issue. There are many political implications of this Expropriation Act, both domestically and globally. I just want to talk about how what is happening as far as this expropriation is concerned, not and in this act particularly, but also more broadly. So James Gibson did some research. He surveyed 3,700 people in South Africa, and he asked them this question. Most land in South Africa was taken unfairly by white settlers, and therefore they have no right to land today. That was the question, that was the statement that Gibson put to 3,700 respondents. Now, this is the interesting part of it. Only 8% of whites agreed with the statement, while 85% of blacks agreed. So you can see how polarized this issue has become in the country. If only 8% of whites agree that the statement that most South Africa was taken unfairly by white settlers and therefore they have no right to land today, and yet 85%, it is incredibly difficult in those situations to think about a unitary imagination of the South African nation, because it is so polarized. This land inequality, it's almost like a spatial barrier to the development of a unitary imagination of the South African nation. So in terms of direct political implications, well, the other important thing about this act, the interesting thing about this act, so Cyril Ramaphosa signed it into law in January of this year. He signed it into law. But unlike any other piece of legislation, that when a law is signed by the president, it commences, it is realized. This particular law now has a commencement date, which the president is still to announce. So the president has signed the bill into an act. It is now an act of law, but the actual implementation of it, the commencement of the act, has not been signed by the president as yet, which is an interesting thing given how contentious it is. So let's, I want to rush through here because I've been given 40 minutes and I've already spoken for 45 minutes. I do want to say just something very briefly about the 40,000 white farmers in South Africa. So we know that there are 40,000 white farmers. And we know that Donald Trump established something called Mission South Africa. And this is what Mission South Africa said. Any farmer with his or her family from South Africa, any farmer from South Africa seeking to flee that country for reasons of safety will be invited into the United States of America with a rapid pathway to citizenship. The process will begin immediately. As we know, 2 batches of white farmers have already gone to the US. We know that there are 40,000 white farmers in South Africa, yet 70,000 white South Africans responded to Donald Trump's invitation. I think it's important for us to move away from a simplistic either-or understanding of Afrikaners. If you look at Max du Preez, and you should read some of his articles of late, which I think are really instructive, and the Beterreinders, they don't see AfriForum and Solidarity as representing, or the Freedom Front as representing them at all. They have an entirely different view of themselves as Afrikaners in South Africa. So while these racialized material inequalities in South Africa act as a spatial barrier to a unitary imagination of the South African nation, there are still powerful voices in favor of an inclusive national South Africa. I don't want to go into the details of how this 2024 Act relates to its predecessor of 1975. It's going to take me too long. But I just want to give a conclusion. Given the manner in which the entire legal framework of the state has been set up, I doubt very much that the new Expropriation Act will be effective in speeding up the transfer of land to blacks. Land reform is in essence a state-driven program, relying on the market for it to happen, and means that we're merely tinkering with the problem instead of addressing it. If I can just spend one last minute on this, is if you were to think about one of the enduring problems in all constitutional democracies, and that is that all constitutional democracies emphasize, advocate political equality. We are all equal before the law. We all have the franchise. We all have the full franchise. In other words, we can vote and we can be voted for. But while it maintains political equality like that, it safeguards material and property inequality. And that is mainly through the emphasis on private property. And the particular kind of approach to property that very much of the colonial world has is an approach of your secure domain. It's your land for your own particular purpose and your own particular use. There are many other different approaches to property. They needed to do that. They needed to ensure that they have entire control over the land that they had expropriated. And you'll read signs, wherever you read the sign, trespassers will be prosecuted. That means that this is now my land. I have taken it away from you. You cannot come here. You cannot trespass on it. You cannot walk on it. And I just want to compare that attitude to property to the attitude to property that you would get in very many northern European countries like Scotland or Sweden, where you have rights of access to land. In Sweden, for example, there is a law called allemansrätt, which means that anybody can hike along the coast of Sweden. So even though you can have property that extends to the coast, you cannot prevent people from walking on your land if they want to hike on that land. You cannot prevent them from camping on your land if there are certain regulations. You have to be a certain distance away from their back door and so on. So it's a very different approach to property to what you have in a colonial situation like we have in South Africa. But I think I've spoken far too much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof, for this insightful and important conversation that you have started around the enduring question of land in South Africa. I think it's a very fascinating conversation and very important talk. So let me quickly invite Dr. Koto to briefly respond. And then after that, we open it up to colleagues for comments and questions.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
Yeah. Good afternoon, colleagues. And just maybe some brief remarks from myself. Of course, I think I'm in agreement with much of what Fred has presented here today. What I found interesting is the way he has phrased the nature of the dispossession in South Africa as in terms of its relationship to our constitution as a legalized form of dispossession in the country. And I think also what's very important really is not forgetting that we do have both a rural and an urban land question. The issue that I'm struggling with at the moment really is twofold. On the one hand, there is the question of the methods of redistribution and which party leads that redistribution. Now, Fred has raised the issue that the key current problems we have is that we have a market-led system, which is enshrined in our constitution. And at the same time, of course, a state should lead such a redistribution, but there is serious limitations with our state. Given that context, what are the possible alternatives in terms of movement? The second issue that I think for me stood out quite starkly was, to what extent would this current amendment facilitate restitution? Because restitution so far, of course, is an individual model in, say, let's say, the urban areas. Would it be able to facilitate the restitution process, noting the kinds of problems that have or are said to emerge in current restitution? So in a sense, the model currently is each individual tries and claim restitution, or could there be a nationalized model that could speed up such a restitutional process? That's I think the second thing. The third thing I think is because of the nature of or the lack of redistribution of land in South Africa, why aren't we seeing a visible social force that's driving a struggle to change the current situation? And does that in part explain why our legislative models is so weak? The fact that we can see that there are farm workers who are struggling around the land. There are people in urban areas who are fighting and struggling for land. In fact, there's a lot of court cases going on in those two areas and so on. But in terms of the broader kind of land, one does not get a sense that there are social forces that have mobilized around this. I wondered if you could just deal with some of those issues. Thanks, Simba. That's just small commentary from my side.
Simba,
Yeah,
would you like
thank you very much, Eddie. I don't know, Prof, if you want to respond to that before we open it up.
Yeah, I can respond just by referring to some experiences. So in 2013, with the centenary of the 1913 Land Act, myself and a number of my PhD students published a book called The Promise of Land. And we launched the book at a conference at UCT. And it coincided exactly with a century since the 1913 Land Act was passed in 2013. So it wasn't an academic conference. It was a conference of social movements. Across the country, there were about 300 participants from different social movements across the country, all engaged in battles around land issues. The long and the short of it was that the conference drew up a dossier. I forget what it was called. It was, I think it was called a charter or something like that. Maybe not a charter. But anyway, it drew up a list of demands. It was a very detailed list of demands that was drawn up by the conference. And the conference marched onto Parliament and had arranged with the presidency to hand over the list of demands. This was June 2013, and we gave them until August 2013 to respond. When September 2013 came, we hadn't received a response yet, and we then wrote back to the person in the presidency, I forget what his name was, to say, look, you've not responded. And he very politely said, I'm very sorry, but we lost your document, and could you please send it again? So you're dealing with a situation of complete kind of indifference to the struggles that people are engaged in. These are people that are really engaged in day-to-day struggles around land, and that was the response that you had. And so you are dead right that a huge issue is that the lack of social organization around land issues. But it's not only the land question that has suffered there. Since 1994, there's been a fundamental demobilization across the board in the country. What we've seen are pockets of resistance, which are quite inchoate. You'll see something coming up here and something coming mostly around service provision, and that's about it. But we've not seen a coordinated response that tries to take up the land question and make it an issue of national importance. So we're stuck in an impasse in a way, because the attempts at land reform on the part of the state have been so halting and so impossible to realize that it leaves the vast majority still excluded. And so you have a sense that no matter what happens politically, you require a level of social mobilization that just has not come to the fore yet. What you also have is a level of desperation amongst people that drives them around issues of survival, and very, very, very hard for people in that kind of situation to to be involved in a national movement which would have a program of fundamental land redistribution. But fundamental land redistribution, which doesn't also at the same time lead to a complete collapse, as we've had in Zimbabwe, for example, where there's been a complete collapse of the economy. So there are particular ways in which you have to navigate around this question in a very sensitive way, and also to appreciate that there are very many different ways in which the rural areas themselves are governed. I mean, are you talking about the large ranches of the Karoo, or are you talking about intensive farming in KZN? So they're very different areas. And we've made so many different mistakes. If you look at restitution, you mentioned restitution. One of the biggest mistakes of restitution is that we have changed functioning farms into townships. And that's because the major thrust behind people wanting that land was for a place to live rather than to continue farming. Overwhelmingly, if you look at the history of restitution, they've been here and there, you'll have a successful farmer who's managed to make good as a result of restitution. But the overwhelming majority have been complete failures, because you'd have, let's say, a family farm suddenly being occupied by 200 people. And of course, it's not going to work. And the communal property associations have been a complete disaster because of the way in which community members have been fighting with each other about the little bit of advantage that restitution can give you. So we have failed the people in a whole range of different ways with regard to land reform. And the underlying essence of it is that we've protected white privilege in their ownership over land. That lies at the heart of it. And we've not been able to navigate a fundamental process of redistribution, which also results in productivity on those farms, or results in social housing, let's say, in a place like Cape Town. It still has not been done, even though the new, what do they call it, Independent Development Plan, speaks specifically about creating social housing spaces. But the problems are at an urban area, at a rural area, the reserves all over. It's just been a monumental failure. We've not been able to navigate it properly. So what are the alternatives? You see, what are the alternatives? If you want a land revolution rather than just land reform, there are huge costs to that as well, and the costs which I'm not entirely sure how you would recover from those costs as a country. So, and a land revolution where you nationalize all the land, and that also, as we've seen across the board, is that nationalization almost invariably leads to greater and greater degrees of avarice, of corruption, unfortunately. And so we saddled with a three-way problem as far as land reform is concerned. Corruption is a big issue. I would say it is one of the major issues. Our minister at a parliamentary committee very recently made the statement that the reason that so many restitution cases are settled by cash payments rather than by land, and of course you know that as long as the restitution case is settled by cash, it means that the existing division of land remains intact. The reason that that's happened is that the land affairs officials have been compelling people into those kinds of deals so that there are opportunities for corruption. This is our own Minister of Land Affairs saying that the officials in his department are pressurizing people into accepting cash rather than land because there are opportunities for them to get kickbacks in that interaction. So corruption is a huge problem. But besides that, we also have a problem of competence. We have a problem of people being put into positions for which they are ill-equipped. And then, of course, we have a problem of the lack of political will. But the lack of political will, I think, is also informed by the problem of corruption, because your main motivation is to use the state as a source of accumulation rather than to pursue any agenda for justice in the country as a whole.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof, for your response, and I think it's interesting, and I think you have unpegged one of the interesting narrative that has been quite widespread. I think especially even the former president Thabo Mbeki was highlighting this idea of restituted land. And how people ended up selling that reclaimed land, and emphasizing that probably we should be talking more about the urban land question or urban land reform rather than the rural one. So I think you've highlighted an interesting point there. Let me open up to questions from the floor. But maybe as we wait, I'll just throw in one or two questions there to you, Prof. I think we have a recent visit of the South African delegation to President Trump. And if my memory serves me well, I think one of the representatives from COSATU emphasized that even the latest act is going to be informed by the willing buyer, willing seller, or the market principles. And I just wanted your response to that in terms of the prospects of equitable distribution of land through market principles. And I think that also resonates with another question that that has been thrown in the chat. That do you have any example, for instance, where market-based principles have managed to address historical injustices of land and redistribution? That is another question that is in the chat. Then I have Pedro and Obvious. Let me take those two, and then I'll allow Prof to respond.
Okay.
Yeah. Is it okay if I can take two questions, Prof, from Pedro and Obvious?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you can respond to that.
Okay.
Then I see Obakeng as well, maybe later, the second round. Pedro, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Simba, for hosting us this afternoon on such a refreshing conversation. And thank you, Prof. Fred Hendricks, for your inputs. It's always a pleasure to be in your intellectual presence. Just a comment, maybe two comments quickly. I won't hold the platform for too long. One, the presence of white people in this part of Africa is an outcome of a colonial crime. And that colonial crime entailed the dispossession of the land that belonged to African people. Now, conceptually, therefore, all land in South Africa belongs to Africans. Europeans are settlers on this land. So when we talk about the return and the restoration of the land back into the hands of African people, we're talking about the entire land. Now, it is the Africans themselves, once they reclaim their entire land, who will then decide who else should live on this land and coexist with them as leaders of their land as Africans. So in other words, Europeans, when land is redistributed, will live under Africans, under the authority of Africans, because Europeans are visitors on African land, and African land must be in the ownership and control of Africans. The very same way Europeans behave in China, the very same way Europeans behave all over the world where land is owned and controlled by the people of that land. Secondly, I do not agree, Prof. Hendricks, that we must not expropriate land because we fear corruption. Of course, you might have not said it in those exact words, Prof, respectfully. I'm just paraphrasing. But there is this racist notion across South African higher education that says anything that is in the hands of the state, and because the state is controlled by Black people, therefore it is bound to fail. So the logic in South Africa is once assets become public in a Black country, therefore the public option is going to fail. Therefore, privatize things because private is in the hands of white people, and therefore privatization is the way to go. So white privatization is efficient, Black public ownership is corrupt. And that logic is being sponsored across South African higher education without critique of its risks. So to say something is inherently corrupt because it will be in the hands of Black people is not an academic argument, it's a racist argument. It's a racist ideology, in fact. And such views must be dismissed. There is no development and fundamental transformation of a colonized group that will happen without the public intervention of the state on policy direction. Right? White people are a privileged group today because of the intense state interventions by the apartheid state to develop them exclusively as a race. Apartheid was a legal policy of the apartheid state. That is why today they are a privileged group. No market developed white people to be who they are today. It was the state. So if Black people now fundamentally require, radical reform of their lives, that agenda will only be driven by a state and public control and ownership of assets so that they are targeted as a group for development. One example, which is a small example, unfortunately, look at the difference, the small difference that NSFAS has made, right, in South African higher education post-94, as an example to show that once a state can be involved massively in targeted development of people, the lives of those people will change. Otherwise, there was never going to be a massive presence of Black students in South African higher education without state interventions, So land ownership in the hands of the state for the purpose of turning around the lives of Black people, it's something that must be encouraged and pushed for. And all options, Professor Hendricks, must be put on the table. One, whether that land is compensated for, let's go for it. Whether it is compensated without expropriation, let's go for it. If others go for a mass revolt, let's go for it as well. So all options must be put on the table with one fundamental goal, that the land must just return to Black people one way or the other, by all means necessary. That should be the urgent daily priority of everyone in the state, everyone in social movements. We must all go straight for the return of the land by all means necessary. Let me pause there, Chair, because of time. Thanks.
Thanks, Pedro. Obvious. Let me give Obvious and then allow Prof to respond. And then Obakeng, I see your hand. I'll definitely start with you in the second round.
Okay, thanks, Simba. Thanks, Prof. Hendricks. Yeah, some of the issues have been raised by Pedro, but I just want to quickly make a point. I don't know, maybe it can also be something that is worth you responding to. I'm very skeptical about this legalistic approach that has been taken as far as land reform is concerned, because it appears to me that, I mean, even from your presentation, that this is more of the fetishization of the law. I mean, in other words, there's toying, an element of toying with the law, particularly by the political elite, in a way that works in their favor, placating the masses in South Africa and so forth, without necessarily having the will, the political will, or the revolutionary will to pull through, push through, a genuine land reform program that will strategically, shift land ownership patterns and also perhaps even increase productivity. So I think, yeah, there's a bit of hesitance, and the playing around with the law somehow demonstrates this hesitance, and I think it's problematic from where I'm standing. Sometimes there has to be some kind of revolutionary action, and the political elite might want to play a key role in that. If not, maybe something from below. Thanks.
Thanks, Obvious. Prof, I think let me allow you to quickly respond, and then I would start with Obakeng. I think there's another one also in the chat. I would read it out. Another question.
Okay. So respond first, and then you'll read out the final question.
Yes.
Okay. So let me start with Obvious first on the issue of revolutionary action. When you're looking at revolutionary action, you have to look at the balance of forces that exist and how possible it might be to mobilize around a particular kind of program. And I have to say that if you look at the ways in which social movements, political parties, some of which have put the land question firmly on the political agenda, but they've not developed a program of fundamental land reform. There's a huge amount of rhetoric, a huge amount of emotion, but very little as far as practical politics is concerned in terms of how it's going to be accomplished. I agree very much with Pedro that the land question should be our priority. 100% in agreement with him about that. You can't have a situation in a democracy where 40,000 farmers own half of our country. That is an untenable situation as far as democracy is concerned. But how to accomplish that? We're not going to accomplish a more equitable distribution simply by saying we want a more equitable distribution. There needs to be a much more concerted effort to accomplish it. And that effort can be, and I agree, can be at a whole range of different levels. But there has to be some way in which there is a national coordination of it. If you have inchoate uprisings here and there and occupations of land, I mean, we've got a recent occupation of land in just outside Cape Town between Grabouw and Elgin. And it's 1,800 hectares. It used to be under forestry, but the people have lived there. They are claiming an indigenous right to the land. These are Khoikhoi and San people who are reclaiming the right to the land. They've invaded the land. They've taken over the land, and they're now demanding services to that land. So there are lots of things like that happening across the country. But there has to be a way in which there's some kind of coordination of it. And I have to say that anybody who talks about people being inherently corrupt, that obviously is a racist statement to be making. Nobody is inherently corrupt. If anything, if corruption is inheres in people's being, then the entire world has people that are corrupt. Corruption is all over. You have different levels of corruption, of course, but it is across the world. There's no question about that. What you have to look at, though, is the record of what has actually transpired, and then to try to look at to what degree the extent of corruption has undermined the prospects of the state from doing even the little that it claims it wants to do. I must say that around the question, there are no, as far as I know, examples of market-based land reform succeeding in redistributing land globally. There aren't any. The examples of successful land reform have almost always been driven by the state. It is necessarily a state-driven project. My problem is the fact that we have a crippled state, a state that has been crippled by corruption. And it's not a question of saying that people are inherently corrupt. The evidence is overwhelming of that corruption. And the evidence of incompetence is overwhelming. The evidence of the lack of political will is overwhelming. So you have to look at what the evidence says and then draw conclusions from that evidence to come up with an analysis of the situation. So I never made the statement that we mustn't expropriate because of fear of corruption. I'm saying that corruption is one of the reasons that it is difficult to expropriate. It's a different thing entirely, because we now have expropriation without compensation on our books. It's not going to lead to terribly much, as I showed. It's very circumscribed. If you're a white farmer on your land and you're working the land, it is impossible to expropriate you without compensation. That is what our law says. If you own land and you're not doing anything with it, or if you own land and you have abandoned it, you've absconded from the land, then you can be expropriated without compensation. So given the current political setup, the political and the legal setup, I'm not fetishizing the legal environment at all. I'm just looking at what is permissible in terms of the law and what people have done. I mean, the people who've occupied land in Elgin and Grabouw, they have flouted the law. They have occupied that land. And it used to belong to the Department of Forestry, but they are now on the land. They are living there. They've got their own signs to get into the area. They've done that. There's nothing about, they flouted the law completely. So how do you deal with that kind of situation? One municipality from Stellenbosch is providing water for them as what they're calling a humanitarian act. But there needs to be a much more agile, I suppose, response to something like that. The land was not being used by forestry. The land was lying there, and these people have moved in. And there are many, many, many of them who have built their own houses and building roads and making a community out of an area. It's not there at all. Yeah, so I think have I answered all the questions? Yes, no. So effectively, even though the new Expropriation Act allows for expropriation with nil compensation, overwhelmingly, you've seen the conditions under which that can happen. Overwhelmingly, as far as the land reform program as a whole is concerned, Lossie is right. It's going to be a market-based willing buyer, willing seller arrangement. And that, as we know, is going to be extraordinarily slow. And it's not going to lead to the kind of outcomes as far as justice is concerned that the majority of the people in the country desire.
Thank you, Prof. Yeah, I'm conscious of our time. We're about 20 or so minutes over time. But let me allow Obakeng, and I've also a few of my students that have thrown their questions in the chat, Prof. So Obakeng, you can come in, and then I would read out one of the questions that was sent to me. Yes, Obakeng, go ahead. Are you there? Unfortunately, we cannot hear you, Obakeng. I can see you are unmuted, but we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me, Doc?
Yes, it's better now.
Yes. I was saying that I think Prof. Hendricks and Prof. Ntsebeza, they correctly categorized the Section 25 of the Constitution when they say that, in effect, colonial land theft is now preserved by the constitutional sanction. So I think from that vantage point, you can make sense of the microeconomic development policy of the current regime from that vantage point. I think what we see perhaps with this expropriation bill, its preoccupation is really on the urban land. It's not really interested on the agricultural land that is half of the land that is, important to the majority of the landless Black people of this country. So it's preoccupied mainly with buildings, because the issue will come, for instance, where I'm located, in the largest irrigation system, in the world, which is Valharts, where there are large tracts of land there. Now, how do you determine that the land, the agricultural land is abundant, whereas the agriculture, sector is a seasonal, there are rotational planting of crops and all of that. So it brings a lot of complicated issues on how to determine on the agricultural sector whether the land there is neglected or abandoned. So I think the focus is just to expropriate buildings left in Hillbrow and other CBDs in the country. But again, I think from here, we can also note that there's this consistent, continuation of this new liberal policy framework, because now we are sitting with NDP, of which also, if I'm not mistaken, it also says that, there are constitutional imperatives that needs to be considered when you expropriate. So in essence, what we have to do from where I'm sitting is that there needs to be an overhaul of the microeconomic policy of this country. But for the microeconomic policy to be overhauled, the politics also needs to be changed. And how do we change the politics? I think the question is, how do we change the politics that informs the policy formulation of this country? Because the 25% that has been achieved by the government is the 25% that is located in arid provinces with no fertile or functional land for any purpose.
Mainly, sorry, Obakeng, there's some feedback. I don't know if you have some people in the room that are also online.
Yes, Doc.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, my last point was that even this 25% that has been projected as a form of success in terms of redistribution and restitution the past 30 years, it's useless parts of land, like in the Northern Cape where it's arid and some parts of Mpumalanga there, where you find that the land is really not useful for any purpose. So, but this takes us back to the politics and takes us back to the macroeconomic policy that needs to be formulated so that we can achieve a complete distribution and restitution of land in this country. No, thank you, Doc.
Thanks, Obakeng. Shane, I don't know if you can throw in your question maybe very quickly, so that I also read out a few other questions for Prof to respond. I think this will be our last round for because of time. Shane, if you can just be straight to your question.
Yeah. Yes. It is actually a few questions that need a little bit of context. Yeah. Is it okay if I go? Continue anyway?
Yes. Go ahead, Shane.
Thank you for having me, Prof. Yes, as this is a very interesting topic, and yes, I would like to give my input. I'll start off with a funny joke, or what I think is a joke, because Prof, you did mention it's a complicated situation whether you, if I quote you correctly, if you put the land in the hands of the black, if you put the hands in the black chiefs, the feudal lords, or if you put it in the hands of the colonial settlers. It's a problem either way. That's a problem that we have to look into. But in finding the solution, nobody is imagining putting the land or the task of state within the hands of the brownies of the country. There's in this racialized conversation of land appropriation and many of our systems. A lot of us, we're looking for solutions, but then we miss the fact that there's an obvious answer there. We can look into the colors as a joke, but in a real way as well. The second thing I wanted to add on, I wanted to ask you about. I really appreciated the fact that you really encompassed the whole land appropriation conversation by bringing up the rural areas as well as the commercial agriculture as well as the urban areas, because it's very important that, in a way, South Africans, we do have land. It is just that many of these land areas, urban areas, are underdeveloped. And you mentioned it. You mentioned we need state intervention there, and a state that is functioning well. My question comes from that is I see that you encompass all these parts of it, but I never really hear South Africans talk about reparation. We even reference Donald Trump and all these things that they do in that country. But yes, I know money doesn't solve the problem, but money holds a part of people's agency within the country. So I do believe that in looking for solutions, we can look into reparations as well. And then finally, and that is, I believe, is my, to my colleague, I think it's...
Thanks, Shane.
Pedro. Okay. Should we be done?
Thanks, Shane. Let me allow Sisipo to come in. Thanks, Shane. Sisipo, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Just to read out my question in the chat as I for a presentation. It is a insightful presentation. Do you think, in your view, the current discourse around expropriation without compensation shows a genuine transformative agenda, or do you think it is more of a symbolic politics? And then just to add in another question around gender, what are the gender dynamics around land expropriation without compensation? Like, are women also included, especially women that are in the homesteads, like women that are in the rural or customary context?
Thanks, Sipho. I think, Prof, let me read out the last one, which is related to what have also been raised here. And then you respond. This will be our last round, Prof. The other question that I have is, how do political parties use land to mobilize support, and what impact does this have on policy coherence? And how does land appropriation intersect with issues of race, class, and power? And how do political parties use these intersections in their electoral strategies and narratives? And I think some of the issues are part of what you actually touched on in your presentation. But
yeah, no, if I were to answer that, I'd give my lecture all over again.
Yeah.
Anyway, I would like to respond to the issue of reparation, because I think that besides everything else, that's the only issue that has not been dealt with in any kind of coherent way. And it touches on something that that Pedro mentioned earlier on, that all land belongs to Africans. And then once that statement is made, the question is, who are Africans? And if you follow the definition of Africans, which came from the Pan-Africanist Congress, then an African is anybody who pays allegiance to the continent. In other words, it's not a racialized, and I'm talking about the definition developed by Robert Sobukwe, the PAC. In other words, it is not a racialized definition. It does not provide a racialized definition of what an African is. I think that's quite an important point to make, because it talks to what Shane was raising about the browns of the country. Just as a matter of fact, as I mentioned, the Khoikhoi and San people, or people claiming to have Khoikhoi and San origins, they are the ones that are mobilizing around taking the land between Grabo and Elgin in the Cape, just outside Cape Town. And so they're doing that anyway. The question of reparations is I don't know if you've been following the court cases. You mentioned Lungisile Ntsabeza. His brother Dumisa was very actively engaged in a campaign for reparations, which was basically kicked out because the state at the time refused to enjoin the battle for reparations. In other words, the state sided with capital rather than with the people. I don't know if you've looked at all of that, but reparations is a very important issue. I think that we have to move away as far as possible from essentialisms. Essentialisms in our definition of who an African is, as Robert Sobukwe did. He moved away from an essentialized or racialized definition of an African. For him, the people in Tunisia were Africans, and they are very fair-skinned people. People in North Africa are Africans. So anybody who pays allegiance to the continent, and anybody who is willing to accept majority rule, can be considered an African as far as Robert Sobukwe is concerned. I didn't quite understand the Val Hart's question, I think that was more of a statement rather than a question. But it is, you're not going to accomplish very much if you stick to a particular essentialized or ethnicized notion of politics. It's not going to succeed. It's going to lead to greater and greater divisiveness and greater problems for the country as a whole, because you still want to develop. I think that this is quite an important thing. You still want to develop, as far as possible, an inclusive, democratic, non-sexist. I think the issue of gender is vitally important, because it's implicated in the land question in very real ways, especially in the areas that are under customary tenure or some form of communal tenure, where the rights of women are seriously compromised. You see, if you look at very many of those areas, because of the migrant labor system, which was the main route through proletariatization for very many South Africans, you had female-headed households in the reserve areas. But with the implosion, especially of the mining industry, and many of these males returning back to the rural areas, it's led to huge gender issues and very often violence in those areas as a result of an assumption of patriarchy or patriarchal dominance, which is problematized because they're not contributing anymore to the household. They're not working anymore. And so that unemployment, the poverty that they have is causing that kind of gender issue. And land is principally involved there. What our country has done, and I think that you have to give credit where it's due, and it has opened up spaces for women, especially at official levels, in the level of parliament, for women participation, which has not been the case. South Africa is the only country on the continent where gender discrimination is criminal. I was just saying that is how it is normalized, but the fact that gender discrimination obviously happens and it's not prosecuted. If you look at the number of rapes in our country and so on, that's very definitely there. But at least there is a semblance of normative appreciation of the necessity for gender equality, and I think that we can say that that exists in South Africa. It's quite a progressive place from that point of view, and also from the point of view, and I must say this, from the point of view of freedom of expression, which is part and parcel of our democracy, and which doesn't exist in any other African country to the extent that it exists in South Africa. The level of repression in very many other African countries is very, very, very severe, and it hasn't happened in South Africa. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. And maybe let me abuse my position as the chair to make the final request. I think for our students, it will be very interesting conceptually, some of our students that are on the platform. I think you had initially highlighted when you were starting that you can make that distinction between decolonization and decoloniality and their intersections with, of course, land dispossession and land inequalities in South Africa. I just wanted you maybe to speak to that maybe very briefly. As the last point, I don't know, Shane, you had a hand up. Is that a legacy hand or is that a follow up? Okay. No, I think
personally, Dr. Sembangase, I personally like to have a longer conversation, and I don't think the platform allows us to do that. We can carry on.
Okay, no, thanks a lot, Shane. Yeah, we are way over time, and I'm sure we Prof would have other, but I think we can always engage. I would share Prof's email, and I'm sure you'll be happy to respond to some of your questions.
Okay, let me just speak briefly about decolonization and decoloniality. So decolonization was premised on nationalism. Nationalism was supposed to be the antithesis of colonialism. That was the way in which it was couched. Unfortunately, as many critics have shown, that nationalism did not end up being the antithesis of colonialism. Many of the nationalist leaders mimicked the former colonial rulers in very many ways. And so instead of nationalism being what is going to get rid of colonialism, instead of nationalism being the vehicle towards decolonization, what nationalism has done across the continent is to inherit the essential features of colonization. And the essential features of colonization is essentially the land. To inherit the existing division of land, because colonization effectively means taking away other people's land and making it your own. And decolonization was meant to be to take back that land that was taken away from you. And so the process of decolonization has been halted by the inability to redistribute land to the mass of the population. That's quite clear. When you're dealing with decoloniality, you're dealing with a much greater issue of how cultural attitudes surrounding coloniality continue to exist. And around the main issue there is the assumption of a kind of supercilious assumption of white supremacy, of white being right, of white being supreme, and so on. So the assumption of white supremacy means that while colonization in terms of the land has not been gotten rid of, the colonial attitudes of white being right and white being supreme, white supremacy, and so on, whites being in power basically at the cultural level, at the level of language, and so on. Decoloniality is supposed to challenge that level of enduring whiteness, enduring colonial whiteness. It's not just, the two are very closely interconnected, but you can't really arrive at decoloniality without decolonization. In other words, you can't arrive at an attitude that fights white supremacy if you have not liberated the land. You can't do that. Then it's just merely talking about it, talking about Ubuntu and so on, without the base from which you can talk about it. And the base from which you can talk about it is the base of decolonization, a reclaiming of the land to the indigenous population. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Prof, for this very important and fascinating conversation. Yeah, I know there are many people that would have wanted to ask questions, and I mean, because of time, we cannot accommodate all of them. And my apologies, Prof, for being over time, but I think you can see this is a very interesting and very contentious question as well, the land question. But let me take this opportunity to thank you, Prof, for making time and leading this important conversation. I'd also want to thank Dr. Koto for facilitating this talk and also for responding to Prof's earlier submissions. And I also want to thank everyone who has attended, and I think many of you have always been attending since the semester started, and now we are busy with examinations, and we are taking a short break, and we'll be resuming maybe after some few weeks. So thank you very much, everyone, for being with us up to the end. So enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you very much, Prof. We'll definitely call you back again. We are learning a lot from you, and we are benefiting quite a lot, including our students as well, from these important questions.
Okay. Thanks, Simba. Thanks, Eddie. Thanks to all the people who participated. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Prof. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay. Bye-bye then.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we are just taking a short break, maybe for a couple of weeks or 3 weeks, and then we'll resume again when we are done with the exam processing and other more pressing stuff. But thank you very much for always supporting us and making this very engaging. We really appreciate. We don't take that for granted. We really appreciate that. So enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Hey,
Dr. Simba.
afternoon. Yes, John, how are you? Thank you very much for attending.
I'm good, Prof. Thank you very much. I only see our colleague is joining us only now, Prof. Chinguno.
Yeah, no, I think he's been busy with other meetings with SASA, so he is very busy at this moment.
Yes.
I'm here, John. I'm here. I'm not there. I'm listening, John. I'm here, John. How are you, John?
I'm good, Prof. I'm good.